Hope you're having a good week, class. I'm still kind of getting over the fact that Atlanta lost to New England, but that's just the Super Bowl. This week we're going to be talking about Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul's letter to the Romans is probably the most important book in the New Testament. It was very important to early church leaders. A lot of the foundational theology that became Orthodox Christianity in early Christianity, when the Jesus movement turned into the official religion that we know as Christianity today, a lot of those early scholars used the letter to the Romans. And then later in the Reformation, Martin Luther used the letter to the Romans as his statement to really kind of lead the charge in the Protestant Reformation. And evangelical Christianity and most Protestant Christianity in America tend to pay close attention to Paul's letters, in Romans in particular. So a lot of the theology that undergirds Protestant Christianity in America and really around the world is very Pauline, and that comes from the letter to the Romans. In addition, every major theologian and biblical scholar in the 20th century has dealt with Paul's letter to the Romans. So Romans is very important to the New Testament and Christianity in general. And it has to do with the fact that it's kind of a letter and kind of not. Paul has never been to this church at Rome, so it's the only letter that we have that Paul wrote to a church that he didn't start. Now, at the end of Romans, it seems like he knows a lot of people there, but he still didn't start this church. So he kind of lays out his gospel, really. That's why Bart Ehrman calls it Paul's gospel. And he lays it out kind of systematically. Now, this isn't a systematic theology by any stretch of the imagination, but Paul does kind of break up Romans to really capture the essence of what he understands the Jesus movement to be about. So it's incredibly important. I hope this week is interesting to you. I do all the readings. Read through the book of Romans, through the letter of Romans. Read Ehrman's commentary about it, and enjoy it. Really kind of plug in this week and pay real close attention to Paul's letter to the Romans. As I've already said, the letter to the Romans is probably Paul's most important letter that he writes, mainly because he's not writing to alleviate a specific problem at the church in Rome, and that's what makes Romans fundamentally different than any letter that Paul wrote. So this letter really kind of encapsulates Paul's gospel, if you will, and he'll talk about that over and over again. So let's talk about the letter. Here is just some boats in Venice, Italy. The pictures you'll see, the first one was obviously of the Colosseum in Rome, but all the pictures in this lecture are from Italy. This is Venice. So let's talk about the letter. It is the most thoroughly theological letter that Paul wrote. While he does deal with theology and theological language in his other letters, those letters specifically address issues that those churches were facing, and Paul started those churches. So for instance, the churches in Galatia, they're dealing with circumcision and how Gentiles are incorporated into the Jesus movement, and Paul deals specifically with that. First Thessalonians, they're dealing with end time issues. What happens when somebody dies and Jesus hasn't come back? Paul writes specifically about that. And he writes theologically about those issues, but he's dealing specifically with that issue. The issue is what prompted Paul's letters. And this happens in all of his letters. But in Rome, this letter, he's not addressing any specific issue. And so it's thoroughly theological. The first 11 chapters are all theological. And it's in these 11 chapters where Paul really outlines his gospel of salvation. So for your paper, this letter will be important. I think you can certainly look at the Gospels and Acts for sure, but Paul deals specifically with salvation in his letter to the Romans, and he really kind of outlines the way he understands salvation. And the next lectures will get into that a little bit more. But this is where he really kind of lays out his gospel of salvation. And he's doing this to alleviate any concerns that the Roman church may have about his message. And remember in Galatians, where he says that he brought his gospel before the leaders in the church of Jerusalem, and they all agreed that his gospel was okay. Well, now we get the content of that gospel, and it looks like he's doing something similar to this church in Rome. He's basically writing this letter saying, this is my gospel. This is what I preach. This is how I understand Jesus. This is how I understand salvation. And he's doing that to maybe alleviate any concerns that the church at Rome had about Paul. And those concerns, before I go on, are the same kind of concerns that Paul deals with over and over and over again. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Paul uses typical Greek rhetorical style to make his case. He specifically uses diatribe or diatribe. This is very common in Greco-Roman rhetoric, where you set up a straw man and basically any kind of critiques that's been levied against you, you make the straw man say that, and then you refute the straw man and show him how ridiculous it is. Paul does this often. So this is the Greco-Roman rhetorical style, really, called diatribe. As the letter's set up, the first 11 chapters primarily address Paul's gospel. Now, I understand that it's broken down into chapters 1 through 4, chapters 5 through 8, and chapters 9 through 11. We'll get that a little bit later. But then chapters 12 through 15 really deal with community ethics or morality. Specifically, Paul's basically saying that his gospel, the gospel he preaches, doesn't lead to immorality. Actually, the gospel that he preaches leads to community ethics. And then chapter 16, the second half of chapter 15 and chapter 16 are really a closing to the letter. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Rome itself. All roads lead to Rome. That's an old saying that's actually true for a real specific reason we'll get into. Rome, unlike all the other major cities that Paul went to, Rome was the most powerful city in the Western world at the time Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. So while Corinth was a major city that had 2 ports and very important for trade, while Thessalonica was another port city with a major trade route going through it, the Ignatian Way, and while Philippi is another port city with the Ignatian Way going through it, while all those cities were really important, they all paled in comparison to Rome. The Roman Empire was headquartered right here in this city. It was the capital of the empire. It was the home of the emperor and the home of all the senators, which made it the wealthiest and the largest city in the empire. So when Rome would conquer a people group or a region, they would take some of the most important things in that region and bring it back to Rome. The gold and the silver and the cloth and the dyes and anything of value really was brought back to Rome. And so Rome was just this incredibly wealthy city, the most opulent city of the period. And the reason why all roads led back to Rome was the fact that Romans invented paved roads. It was a new technology. I've already said this in some lectures, but they literally put stones over mud or over dirt, and they put level stones, flat stones, so that horses and chariots and means of transportation would you could go whether it rained or not. And this was a incredible invention and technology that made trade and commerce and travel possible. Now, they were mainly made for the Roman army to go and get from point A to point B with speed, but it revolutionized the world at the time. It was the internet of this period. And so it's all these roads started in Rome, and they paved the roads out of Rome, and so all roads literally led back to Rome. The other thing that's important to note is that Nero was the emperor during Paul's ministry, almost all of it, really. And Nero is traditionally credited with putting Paul to death around 64 or the Common Era. So, as you can imagine, Rome was this major city, the most densely populated city in the empire. Many gods and goddesses were worshipped in Rome. It was thoroughly polytheistic. Because there were people from all over the empire in Rome, there was a mixture of all sorts of gods. The emperor was worshipped as a god, and there were shrines to him on just about every corner. And every time you passed it, you had to put an offering in the shrine. So thoroughly polytheistic, and Christians would have had a real interesting time making it there in the face of that kind of polytheism that was on every corner. So let's talk about the church at Rome. What can we know about it? We believe that Paul's letter got to this church around 57, 58. The letter to the Romans, most scholars believe is later in Paul's life, if not one of the last things that he wrote. Philemon was certainly one of the last ones too. But he wrote this. There's no indication that he's being brought to Rome as a prisoner. We hear this story in Acts, where Paul ends up going to Rome, but as a prisoner. He's basically condemned to die. And the Acts ends with Paul in jail at Rome. Now, if that happened around 62, this letter would have to have been written before then. And it doesn't look that like in this letter Paul is anticipating being put in jail anytime soon. So it would have to been before any kind of incarceration that he faced that's indicated in the book of Acts. Now, we don't know if Acts can be a credible source for that or not, but this is why scholars believe that it was written or received around 57 to 58. The church there at Rome was primarily a Gentile church by then. This is later on in your theological career and in your theological education, you'll get into anti-Semitism and Paul and how Paul is used to do some pretty horrific things in the history of Christianity, specifically his letter to Rome. And there's a lot of argument about the letter of Romans in that kind of anti-Semitic or not argument within the field of New Testament studies. I'll just have you know that a lot of scholars right now believe that the church in Rome was primarily Gentile. So this letter is written to Gentiles. And that's in keeping with Paul's understanding of his own ministry as a ministry to Gentiles. One reason we think it's primarily Gentile at this point is that according to kind of this document called The Life of Claudius, the emperor creates an edict in the year 49 that expelled Jews from Rome. Now, we don't know, just because a Roman emperor makes an edict doesn't mean that it absolutely happens in totality. So we don't know if all Jews had to leave Rome, or if some of them did, or if some of them stayed and kind of acted very Roman and neglected their Jewishness. We don't really know, but we know that there was an edict that Claudius passed in 49 that expelled Jews from Rome. And it was over this argument about one called Christus. A lot of New Testament scholars argue that this is a debate within the Jewish community about Jesus, specifically related to Gentiles. We don't really know for sure, but it probably does look like a Jewish argument about Jesus. But this definitely impacted the church in Rome. So, and look at Ehrman, page 403. Read that section; it'll help you out on that. And this church was surrounded by the imperial presence of the emperor. There were statues to Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, and other Caesars all over the place in Rome. If you go to Rome today, those statues are still there. I mean, it was inescapable. So empire was all around. And Rome was the center of the imperial world. So being Christian there looked different. I mean, it was kind of in the face of empire. So what we also know about this church is that Paul had never visited the church at Rome before, and you can see this in chapter 1, verses 10 through 15. He's never been there. And unlike all of Paul's other letters, he does not address any specific problem that's arisen in the Roman church. So there's no place in here where he's dealing with a specific issue that's happened. And that's unlike any other letter he wrote. And he basically writes this letter, and check out chapter 15, verses 23 through 24. He wrote this letter to kind of say, here's what my gospel is, mainly because I want to stay with you guys, and then I want you to send me to Spain on a Western mission. So he's basically trying to get the church at Rome to endorse him and send him out on this mission that he wants to accomplish in Spain. And so the letter seems to address some concerns that the folks may have had about Paul or Paul's gospel and ministry. In other words, this relationship between Gentiles and Jews in the Jesus movement really just kind of wraps itself around Paul's life and ministry. He has to deal with this almost in every letter that he writes. In the letter to the Philippians, it looks like he has some opposition based on the way he interprets the law and the need for the law for Gentiles, whether they should follow it or not. This is certainly the case in the letter to the Galatians. This comes up in his correspondence with the Corinthians. So all through Paul's ministry, his conception of the way Gentiles are incorporated is always challenged. He has serious opposition. So the major section of this letter, Paul is basically, and this is my gospel, this is why I believe what I believe, and this is how I understand the relationship between Gentiles and Jews with each other and with God. And so this issue continually causes Paul a problem, and this letter really kind of lays it all out. He's like, this is how I believe about this. And it looks like he's writing that because the church may have some serious questions about it. They might have heard about Paul and heard that his gospel wasn't valid, or they may have heard from the opposition group that Paul wasn't everything that he was supposed to be. So these guys have doubts about him, and this letter, he's kind of outlining his gospel to alleviate those questions. So this is a picture of a city in Italy, a modern city in Italy. While it's modern, you can see all the terracotta roofs. Cities in Paul's day would have looked a lot like this. So I'd show you that just to give you an idea of what these cities around the Greco-Roman world would look like. So let's look at an outline of the letter to the Romans itself. This mosaic here is a mosaic of Jesus' baptism. It's in a church in Ravenna, Italy. It's a beautiful little church. This is actually the roof of the baptismal room at this church, and it's just beautiful. So you can see Jesus there being baptized. Um, but let's look at the outline of the letter. Romans 1 through 4 deals specifically with God's wrath and salvation. That Paul kind of outlines that there. Chapters 5 through 8 is all about freedom through Christ's death and resurrection. Romans 9 through 10 is a crucial part of this letter, and that's where Paul deals specifically with salvation for Jews and Gentiles. Since Jesus comes, does that change the covenant that God has had with God's people historically or not? And that is an important couple of chapters in the letter. And then starting with chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 15, 13, this is moral teaching and community ethic. And then Paul closes the letter from chapter 15, 14 through 16, 27, where he lists more names than almost any letter. Well, more names than any other letter that he writes. So while he doesn't know the church, while he's never been there, he certainly knows a lot of people at this church. In other words, there might have been a migration to Rome anyway, and a lot of his friends had kind of made their way to this place. Well, that's kind of an introduction to the letter to Paul's letter to the Romans. In the next lectures, we're going to get real specific to each section. So if you have any questions, just send me an email. Thanks.